Good morning. Today the verse is in Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 20. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under foot by men. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Do not think I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke I shall pass from the law until all is accomplished. Whoever there annuls one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches them, he should be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven.
Completely went. There we go. All right. This is as good a time as any to address the fact that we've had some sound issues, had some tech issues. And I've heard before that the devil is in the details. I think he's also in the wiring. But I want you to know the team, they're actually doing a great job. We're playing with a bunch of new stuff and trying to get everything dialed in. And my voice, I know, is a bit lower than the average preacher, so they have to adjust the sound waves and all that fun stuff. But thank you, Claire, for reading the text for us today. You probably didn't see it on her face, but she was not happy that I appointed her to do that, so I appreciate you just rolling with it. Well, we're continuing our series in Jesus Live. What would Jesus say, or what would we hear Jesus say if we were to go back in time and be there for his public ministry? We wouldn't get to hear all the behind-the-doors conversations he has with the apostles. We wouldn't get to be there for the famous Nick at Night, John chapter 3 conversation with Nicodemus. We wouldn't be with him for the 40 days in the wilderness. In fact, if we were to just take the gospel accounts of Jesus' life, and aside from the 40 days that he's in the wilderness being tempted, we only have 52 days of Jesus' life recorded for us. Imagine if he had social media and he made one Instagram post a day, which for some of us is nothing, and for some of us it's a ton. Depends on how much you're on social media. But if he only did one a day, he'd only have 52 posts for his entire timeline being on Instagram. It's not a whole lot. Yet everything we know about Jesus we find in the Gospels and in the rest of the text. And here we're looking at the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' first big public sermon. He had a few big sermons, some in public, some in private. He had the upper room discourse, time with the apostles in just the upper room, an intimate moment. We'll address that when we get closer to Easter. He had the Olivet discourse where he is up on the Mount of Olives and he's speaking out loud for those to hear. And he's speaking about when he will come back one day and what the future holds for his people. But here we come to the Sermon on the Mount, and in some ways this is bread and butter Christianity. This is our basic game plan for living the Christian life. If you were to ask, I think his name was Jim Wooden, football, my goodness, I'm not a sports guy, basketball coach, what made your team so great? It was the bread and butter. It was the basic plays. It wasn't some fancy trick shot. It wasn't, this complicated routine. It was the basics. And sometimes we like to, if we watch football, we want to see those fun trick plays. The one where the peewee quarterback takes the ball and goes, hang on, let me look at this. Hey, ref, and they just kind of walk past the line and they just take off. Like, those things are fun, but you can't build a team on that. And if we're going to look at the playbook of a Christian, maybe there are some trick plays. I haven't found any, but maybe there are some, fancy whatnots that we can try, strategies. Really, it's the bread and butter. It's the basics that we need to master, that we need to handle in our walk with God. And here in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus starts with the Beatitudes, but we're not starting there. Most theologians would agree that the section we're looking at, it is the primary focus. If you will, it is the conclusion of all of the rest of the Sermon on the Mount. If we put it to action, what will it look like? It will look like this. If we live out the Beatitudes, it will look like this passage. If we live out obeying the law under the grace of God, it will look like this. After we read through the Beatitudes, we might be tempted to become monks or separatists, that we just disappear from everybody. And it's like, you know what? If I'm going to live a life where I'm going to be merciful, pure in heart, if I'm going to be a peacemaker, I surely cannot do that as a part of society. If I'm going to be a peaceable person, I need to depart from every other person I know. While it may make it kind of easy in the moment to say, hey, I don't fight with anybody because I don't talk to anybody, that's not living out the Christian life the way we're supposed to. In fact, we're not called to go be monks. In fact, every time the church has gone through what we call a monastic movement, where they've pursued being monks, it has hurt the church. We're not supposed to depart from the rest of the world. We're supposed to stay in the world, but not be of the world. So how do we do that? What does that look like? Here, Jesus starts off with a couple examples. He calls this the salt of the earth. We use that as a compliment sometimes if we're talking about somebody. Oh, hey, yeah, you know, John, man, salt of the earth kind of dude. And they're just good people. I use that term good relatively because no one is good but God. See, Christians are called to enhance and preserve the world, within the world, by being the salt of the earth. We're called to enhance and preserve. That's something that us Christians are called to do, as we are agents of salt, if you will. Salt was a valuable commodity in the ancient world. In fact, if somebody was really good and it were worth their wages, you would say they're worth their salt. The word salary comes from salt because you get paid in salt. That was how the instead of gold or silver or greenbacks or whatever, you got salt because it was incredibly valuable. Salt was life. In fact, if you did not have salt and the food that you were eating didn't have the right amount of sodium in it, it would lead to your own demise. My mom is a nurse, and she's told me about patients without breaking HIPAA. Don't worry, she didn't break HIPAA or anything like that. Just the general cases of, oh yeah, had a guy come in, his sodium levels went out of whack, and for a few days he lost his mind. We got him back, we got his sodium where it should be. Salt is incredibly valuable. It has a purpose. Salt also doesn't expire. Now, if you see an expiration date on the bottom of your salt, the United States government makes Morton put it there. But you're never going to open up salt and be like, my goodness, it looks like salt, it smells like salt, whatever it smells like. But it just isn't salty anymore. It's impossible for salt to not be salty. It is sodium chloride. It doesn't break down, it doesn't become anything else. In fact, if it does, we're in danger because sodium and chlorine are both incredibly toxic elements. But together, it brings life. Now, salt can't lose its saltiness, but it sure can become contaminated. It can become dirty. It can become mixed with other things that really diminish its properties, that get in the way of salt doing what it should do, of enhancing and preserving. And salt does a lot of other things as well, but I think these are the main two examples that Jesus is looking at. And he says that you are the salt of the earth. Not you will be, not you can become, but he's speaking to those people who follow him. You are the salt of the earth. Northside, you're the salt of the earth. I mean that as a compliment. I mean that as gospel truth. I mean that in every possible good way. That is something that we are. We cannot change that. If you walk with God, you are the salt of the earth. Now, the quality of that salt, now that may vary. Really, the salt itself doesn't change, but what we add to it. When people look at you, do they see purity? Do they see that God has done a work in your life to strip sin away from you and to build you up in righteousness? Or if they were to open up the little lid of that salt pot or salt cup that you are and go like, ooh, man, looks more like Lowry's. There's a whole bunch of other colors and stuff going on in there. I don't really see the salt. I see everything else. We're also not the salt of heaven. Sometimes we'd like to think about our Christianity, our walk with God, our faith being something that is solely focused on heaven, but we forget about the fact that we are to have an impact here, now, today. We're not the salt of heaven, so where God says, okay, get all your saltiness and hang on to it because one day we're going to use that in glory, but make sure you don't use it now. No, he wants us to have an impact here on earth. Of these multiple reasons that we see for salt being used, especially in the ancient world, two are our primary. One is that salt enhances. It enhances flavor. I saw an article recently on, I like Science and Tech News, that some scientists in Japan have been able to come up with a spoon that has a small electrical charge in it to where when you use it, you don't need to add salt to your food. See, salt is an electrolyte. The reason it makes food taste better is because it allows electronic transfer signals on your tongue to be able to perform faster and more completely, and so you get to enjoy more of the food. That's why when you put too much salt on food, after a while, the salt begins to overpower the flavor itself. You're not just tasting food enhanced, it's just way too salty. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but I'm sure many of us are familiar with hospital food. Nobody ever talks about hospital food in a positive light. Of the countless hospital visits I've made, I've never found anybody who said, you know, Pastor, being here sick really, really stinks, but at least the food is good. No. I've never been told that in my life. In fact, I've been a part of a few smuggling operations, getting food of quality, of flavor, to patients at the hospital. I'm not saying I would do it for you. I've done it for family. I'm not sure what it would look like as the nurses catch me walking in with a double cheeseburger, an extra large fry, and a milkshake, being like, oh, it's communion. No, not sure what I would say. But the reason hospital food is so nasty, oftentimes people are in there on a cardiac diet and it says low salt, no salt, and they go to take a bite of the food and they go like, oh, these green beans taste like green beans. This chicken tastes like, not chicken, it tastes like something else. Like the food is just gross. When the world gets a taste of you as a Christian, what does the food taste like? Do they take a bite and then go like, oh man, that needs some seasoning of some kind? That person, they leave a bad taste in my mouth. We are the salt of the earth. Now, our impact, our effectiveness, that comes down to how we walk with God, how we live out his commandments, how obedient we are to his word, and what we're going to see in a moment, how much we love his law, how much we delight in the law of God, his word. People should see that on us and be like, these people, they enhance life. They make things better. When the Christians are around, everything gets better for everybody. Now, it's not true of all Christians. That's not true of every period in Christian history. But if you look at all 2,000 years of Christendom, and when you see Christianity come to a new people group, you often find liberation. You find freedom. You find equality. You find empowerment. You find a betterment in life. Because it's not about me being more valuable or more important than you in the eyes of God. Know that you and I are equal. And I really have no spot to stand before God and say, I'm more important than these people, because that's in violation of his word. Every time we see Christianity, true Christianity, come to a people group, it brings freedom. It brings goodness. And I would say goodness with a capital G, goodness like God is good. Now, there's been times us Christians have abused that. Times we've taken our freedoms and used them to hurt other people or to hold others down. And I don't mean we hold them back from sin. That's something we should do. We should try to hold others back from sin. In fact, that's the other use of salt. It's a preserving agent. But as Christians, we're not supposed to be bland. Colossians 4, verses 5 and 6 say, conduct yourselves with wisdom toward outsiders, making the most of the opportunity. Let your speech always be with grace, as though seasoned with salt, so that you will know how you should respond to each person. It doesn't say come in there like a spiritual bull in a china cabinet, kicking people in the chest, going, hey, you need Jesus, and treating our Bible like a phone book. Well, it won't leave bruises as we just go around beating everybody up. No, it says know how to speak to each person. Be self-aware so that when you come with gentleness and with grace, people will hear your speech as well seasoned, and it'll be something that they desire. When you take our faith and we share it with other people, and we do it in a heavy-handed, aggressive, forceful manner, it rarely yields any good fruit. But when we come with an open platter and we go, I want you to know about the goodness of God. I want you to see what he's done in my life. Taste and see that the Lord is good directly through him and also by partaking of what you can in my life. See what God has done and what he can do for you. People go, you know what? That's something I want. and they go to it and they freely pick it up. That should be the way we live our life. Don't be bland. In fact, if we were to go back and look at the Beatitudes, we are to exhibit the Beatitudes in our saltiness. Be humble, be gentle, be righteous, be merciful, be pure. When you walk around in life, the world should look at you and go, this person knows God. And we see the evidence in their life. The other, and I believe the more driving point that Jesus is making, is that salt is a preserving agent. I like to make hot sauce. I like to cook. It's how I de-stress. When church gets difficult and rough, I just say, you know what, I need a Friday to disappear and go in the kitchen, and I put in my AirPods and I listen to some podcasts or some stand-up comedians. I love stand-up comedians. They kind of get me to disconnect from everything, and I'll spend all day cooking. And my kids now send me recipes like, hey, make this, Dad. I will say my wife is by far a better cook than me, but I'm more of a chef because I'm extra. I'm just really extra. But I like to make hot sauce, and I make hot sauce with salt. Salt is an integral ingredient in making hot sauce, because I need at least 3% of the total mass, the total weight, to fight off all the bad bacteria and germs and yuckies that want to get in there. In fact, I do want my hot sauce to be alive. I want the right kind of bacteria and the right kind of yeast, like a sourdough or like a yogurt, that type of stuff. You know, those are living things. There's culture in it. But I need salt to make that happen. In the ancient world, if you wanted to live, you would have to salt your meat. You'd kill an animal and you'd bring it in and you'd go through the butchering process and you hold it over the smoke to kill anything on the outside, and then you roll it in salt and you hang it. Sailors, because they would travel across the Pacific and the Atlantic, they would take salted meats because it could be preserved, it would last. Christians, we're supposed to be salt. We're supposed to be a preserving agent. There are two restraining forces in this world that hold back evil. One is the Holy Spirit. We do not control him. He should control us. The other is the church. And when I say the church, I don't mean North Side. I mean all believers at all times and all places. God has us here to have an impact, to have an influence. We're to be a restraining force of evil. There's times we take that too far. And there's times we don't take that far enough. Taking it too far, we miss the mark, and we take things that really shouldn't be inhibited, and we say, no, God doesn't like that. We won't allow it ever. Billy Sunday is famous evangelist and preacher, and I love so much of his work, but I was reading some of his stuff yesterday, and he said, one of the most destructive things in the church, two things are incredibly destructive: dancing and cards. I'm like, okay. I believe in his day they absolutely were. That they were something that was affecting the church because it was an influence into areas where Christians often didn't go. We also live in a different culture today than we used to. We once had a Baptist pastor at a church we were members at, not here in Bakersfield, come to our house one evening, knock on the door, and my dad opened the door. The pastor just walked right in, went to the kitchen, and began opening things. And my parents were like, "Pastor, can we help you?" He goes, "No, I'm good. I'm just looking for alcohol or tobacco, anything else you shouldn't have." If we're to be a restraining, a preserving force, we don't do it by kicking down people's doors, okay? We're supposed to fight evil, to hold back. So that means that for those of us God calls into things like politics, and God bless you if he calls you to politics, I'm grateful he hasn't called me there. We try to do things like legislate morality. And you've maybe heard the phrase, well, we can't legislate morality. Yes, it's exactly what laws are for. We say you should not murder because we say it's an immoral act that should not be done. So we put a law in place. Now, not all laws are that way. Texting and driving is probably a good one to have on the books. But as Christians, the main way we do that isn't by kicking down people's doors. It's not by passing executive orders. It's by having a relationship with people that in our community, in our circles, people we live with. And when they see what God has done in our life, they go, you know what, this person lives a restricted, inhibited life, and look how good it is for them. They don't partake in things the world says you should partake in, yet they're different. Their life is better. They should see that when God works in our life, it's a preserving agent, and we have that impact on the rest of the world. Again, we go back to exhibiting the Beatitudes. Be a peacemaker, not a peacekeeper. The Bible doesn't call us to be peacekeepers. It does say that we should live at peace whenever possible. But here Jesus says, be a peacemaker. That's getting into the middle of the fight and saying, no, I'm stopping this. I'm going to take the heavy-handed approach to make sure the right thing happens, not by breaking people over my will, but by punishing what is evil and rewarding what is right. As parents, we should be peacemakers. Our kids get into a fight, we don't go, well, I'm just going to let them figure it out. There are times we do that. Times I go, this is your problem. I want to see you figure it out, and I'll jump in as the ref if I have to. But as Christians in the world, we should look at things and go, you know what? I'm going to jump in the middle of that. I am not okay with sex trafficking, with human trafficking. I'm going to get involved. I'm not okay with the murder of unborn children. I'm going to get involved in being an activist. I'm going to go pray for people. I'm going to be a minister outside of a clinic. I don't mean screaming at people how much God hates them. Like what some of my friends do is they stand out there and they pray and they offer to talk with people and encourage them and say, you don't have to do this. There is another way. We also don't stoop to the enemy's level. Just because we see the enemy do something does not mean that we should do it. We don't fight fire with fire. Christians are called to enhance and preserve by being the salt of the earth. Jesus uses another metaphor here. He says that we're called to be a light to the world. Christians are called to radiate the light of God. Really, I was torn on using that word radiate. A better word is reflect. We are called to reflect the light of God because we don't generate it within ourselves. Nobody should look at Ty and be like, oh my goodness, look how righteous he is on his own. He doesn't need God. If you ever look at me and think that, please understand you are grossly misinformed. I need the Lord. I need him every day. I need him regularly to the point that there's times I do things and then right away I'm like, God, why am I such an idiot? And I have to go and apologize and make things right with people. But we're called to radiate, to reflect the light of God. I saw a t-shirt once and I loved it. It had a picture of the moon on it. In fact, it was a glow-in-the-dark, like iron-on thing of the moon. On the back it said, be like the moon, reflect the sun. But sun was spelt S-O-N. That's what we're supposed to do as Christians. If you'll notice, I'm saying that our first point is to be light. Our second point, but the first point was not be salty. Please don't be salty. Don't be a salty Christian. One night when I was in Israel, we were near Nazareth. And it was right around sunset. We climbed and kind of hiked up of a mountain in the northern country. And we just got to overlook and see just beautiful territory. And there were some men up there who were just hanging out with one another and smoking and drinking. And a couple of them threw their beer bottles off the edge. And I'm like, well, people are people. We're in the Holy Land. And humans are humans. That's okay. I remember sitting there on the hill and looking up in a distance, and we could see a city on a hill far away. There's nothing that city could have done to hide themselves. They were a beacon. Anybody who has eyes to see could look up and see that. In fact, I was doing some research on what is the most sensitive light-sensing organism in the created world. It turns out, from what we understand, it's the human eye. They think it's possible that a human eye can detect one single photon. Without getting geeky into the science, we have receptors that we make in laboratories that are not that sensitive. God has made our eyes to detect light. In fact, we're drawn to light. It is something that we are drawn to. If you're in the wilderness walking through and you're emaciated, you're thirsty, and you see a light on a hill, and that's the only thing you see, you're going to turn towards it no matter how far away it is, because that's the only hope you have. Notice again, we're the light of the world, not the light of heaven. Any impact or influence, any light you do have that you're reflecting, don't store it and save it for later. Shine it now. Now is when we need to have an impact. We're not going to get to heaven and be like, okay, man, we got a lot of work to do here. This place is rough. No, we're going to get there and go, we got a lot of work to do because God's called us to serve him and each other. But everything will already be perfect. We need to be light here on the world because the world is an increasingly dark place. That means if God calls you to a dark place, be there and be a light there. In fact, lights shine brightest in dark areas. Whenever we go camping with students over the summer, I usually don't take a flashlight. I got pretty good night vision. I'm pretty good at walking around. I can see stuff in front of me. And the most I'll do is pull out my phone. And a phone light in the middle of the forest is nothing. But there's always that one kid whose dad is like a prepper. And he's like, hey, I got a flashlight. And he turns it on, and the sky turns blue, and you're like, my goodness, it's daytime. That little iPhone light is pretty bright in the middle of a dark, dark forest. But that other light is bright enough that if you take it outside on a bright day, it still might cast light. But its power is greatly diminished. Doesn't matter how strong you bring of a light you bring into a well-lit area. The more light that's there, the less of an impact that light you're bringing in has. This tells me there's a really good reason that God puts us in difficult, dark places, because he wants us to have an impact there. We are to be the light of the world, and we only do that by going into dark places. And I don't just mean a worship center that's having its lighting redone. I know it can be a bit dark in here. Don't concentrate your light in well-lit areas. As Christians, we should come together, and this should be an incredibly bright place when we come to worship. But when we head out from here, we should go to places that are dark, places that are far from God, people that are far from God, and say, hey, can I show you the one whom I serve? Can I introduce you to him? Because I promise you, it will bring a light to your life that you've never experienced. There have been times people have tried to hide entire cities. During World War II, during the air raids, I remember seeing a video recently of this unique little light bulb, and it looks like it's been dipped in black paint. And then they put it into a lamp and turned it on, and it casts this very dim, very eerie red light. It's all the light you could have when the sirens would go off in London or other parts of England as the Germans would come and drop bombs, and they would turn off all their lights so they would not be seen. During wartime, that makes a lot of sense. Don't let your cities be bombed. Be smart about it. But for us as Christians, don't turn off your light because you've gone into a difficult area. Jesus didn't do that. The apostles didn't do that. Countless Christians for centuries, for millennia, have not done that. See, light has some unique properties when it comes to living organisms. Light attracts. Light has an attractional force. Now, that could be positive or negative. What kind of things does light attract? Mosquitoes, yeah. It's messing up my analogy. Moths. You turn on a light and moths will just flock. I remember as a kid trying to play with light to try and get moths to land near where I was playing with bugs and stuff so I could catch them, and I didn't quite understand how light worked. I tried to set up something that was really hot. In my mind it was light, but no. Didn't understand things deeply at that age. Light also negatively attracts. It repels cockroaches. So you walk into a dark kitchen, you flip on the light, and you might get moths that start coming out of the cabinets and flying towards the light as cockroaches run and they hide underneath the kitchen, underneath the fridge. And right now you're thinking, I don't want to be in that kitchen. That sounds gross. Is that much different than our world? It's got moths in it. It's got cockroaches in it. It's got things that are broken and dirty and gross. There's some really, really good news about cockroaches. In this analogy, they can turn into moths. In fact, each and every one of us in this room, we were once a cockroach. We didn't like the light. We didn't like conviction. I didn't want to be told the wrong things I had done. No, I am good enough. And while I got saved at a young age, I was still proficient in excuses and pushing off any responsibility. That is human nature. We're really good at not taking responsibility. But a moment comes where the light gets turned on within our soul and we see it for what it really is and we go, oh Lord, I need that. And he does a transformative work in our heart. But the only way that anybody will see the light is by somebody else bringing that light to them. The only way somebody else will experience the saltiness that we're called to be, to preserve and enhance this world, is if we bring it to them. So don't stop being the light, regardless of how people respond. God may have put you in a really, really dark area, and every time you turn on that light, you're like, man, people just run away from me. Keep shining that light. I remember having, I don't know how many conversations, and I know I'll use this phrase again as I talk about other people that myself or others are witnessing to, and we're like, my goodness, aren't they stubborn? But can you imagine what it'll be like when they come to Christ? Can you imagine how great that transformation will be? Anybody who's been forgiven of little appreciates that forgiveness little. But somebody who's been forgiven of a lot, they appreciate that forgiveness quite a bit more. And when somebody's gone from a rebellious cockroach, I hate the light life, and they get transformed by the Holy Spirit, they become a completely different creature, and they appreciate that much more. Jesus says, let your light so shine before men Let it shine before other people. Don't hide it. Why? So they know where you stand. Where you stand should be a clear indication, since you are a Christian, that your life exists, you exist, and everything you do exists to glorify God, to magnify him, to make him great, to make him known among other people, that when people see your behavior, your actions, even when you mess up, they go, this person is different. And sometimes when we do that, people are going to be repelled by it. Sometimes it's a matter of their own conviction. If you've ever been somebody who gave up alcohol at one point before you were living in it pretty heavily, you may start losing your friends. They're like, he's not what he used to be. She's different now that she doesn't drink. Good. Now, I'm not getting up here and saying that every bit of alcohol is intrinsically equally evil. But let me just throw out a basic rule. If you can't control something, it controls you. And if something controls you, you should have no part of it unless that control is the Lord. So don't give yourself over to things that you shouldn't. But when we surrender those sins and God begins to work on our life, others look at that and they go, that is different. Let your light so shine before men so they know where you stand, that you glorify God and that others will join you in that. See, light also exposes things. Last week it exposed that I ended the drought in California by sweating through my shirt. My goodness. I got a text message during the service from my daughter who read for us this morning. She's like, oh my goodness, Dad, you're sweating so much. And I'm like, nothing I can do about it now. So I'm a lot drier today. At least I sure hope it looks that way. The light exposed for you how sweaty I got. See, the light exposes things. As a kid, I was told, hold the light, hold it still. Hold it still, right there. Hold the light right there. That was just my childhood. Probably had nothing to do with yours. One of these days, I'm going to ask my dad to hold the light, and he's going to get it wrong no matter what. And I'm just going to be like, no, that's not holding the right spot. I think about doctors as they scrub into surgery. And they walk into that surgical room, and they're scrubbing up, and there are bright lights in there, and there are bright lights in the surgery room. Why? So you can see what you're doing. And I think about as we get closer to God, I'm going to come stand a little bit in the dark over here. There we go. I can start to see when it starts to get dark because I can start to see you. Right now it's a little bit dim and I can kind of see some of the dirt on my hands. And so as I begin to wash up, I see the light and I go, you know what? I think I did a pretty good job. And I step a little closer to the light and what do I see? I see more dirt. Okay, Lord, I got to come back to you. Help cleanse my heart. Oh man, God, look at what you're doing in my life. I feel like a new person again. Did I get saved again? Did I get more saved? That should be a thought we have in our life as we grow in the Lord. And we go, my goodness, Lord, you got me so clean. Oh man, my hands are really dirty. And we keep getting closer to the light and God exposes more in our life and we begin to wash our hands more and more. And really, when you wash your hands, you don't take two dirty hands and rub them together. If you've ever worked on a car before and you didn't have the right kind of soap for afterwards, that's what you do. You're doing everything you can to get that grease off and nothing will work. You need an external influence to get that dirt and grime off. We need the Lord to cleanse us. And he uses that light of who he is and each other to expose the sin in our own lives. Did you know you need one another to point out your sin? You need the people around you to go, hey, brother, sister, what you're doing is not good. I love you too much to let you stay there. Let me walk with you. If it sounds different than that, like, oh my goodness, you sound like that one popular meme right now. Ugh, brother, ugh. People look at you and they're just like, oh, gross, get away from me. I know you call yourself a Christian, but that sin, no, I can't be around that. Then the Lord needs to do a work in that person's life. Because I remember what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6, and some were such of you. We were once cockroaches. We shouldn't be grossed out by others that are living in sin or struggling with it. But we should, as brothers and sisters, come and bring that light and expose to one another the sin in each other's life. It's not a mean thing. It's not hateful. It's not uncaring. It's the complete opposite when it's done for the right reasons. I want you to walk closer with God. He's called us to a higher standard. Let me walk with you. Give me your burden. And I will go with you to God, and we will set it at the altar together. Be an exposing light for one another. Being a light unto the world is not just for those who do not know God. It's for each other as well. We encourage each other, and we need this in Christian community. The ultimate purpose for spiritual light, spiritual salt and light, is to glorify God. Jesus says that in verse 16, so that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. I can think of 3 ways in which being spiritual salt and light glorifies God. And I'm sure there's more than that, but as a Baptist preacher, we like things in 3, and it's somewhat alliterative. They all start with our. First one is our worship. It's our worship. God is glorified in our worship. Matthew 6:1-6 says, beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven. People might look at these 2 parts in the same sermon and go, Jesus is contradicting himself. No, he's not. He's saying, let your light shine in such a way that it gives attention to God. But if you're bringing attention to yourself, you better knock it off. Because it's not about you. It's not about me. Heaven forbid anybody looks at me and goes, that's the standard of what a Christian should be. No, the standard is far above me. It's something I will not achieve here on this side of heaven. I cannot do it. I need the grace of God, and he continues to do that work within me. But I'll never achieve that pureness of glorification until he glorifies me in my own passing. Don't be salt and light so that you're seen and so that you're noticed. Do it so that God is glorified in worship, both by us and by others. Even if somebody doesn't know God, they look at you and go, whoever you worship and serve, he must be pretty good, because I can see how much you love him and how you live your life. Another way that God is glorified in us being spiritual salt and light is through our own sanctification. I like this term called critical mass. It's a science term. When you take enough of a radioactive isotope and you pack it together in a small enough area, you get this positive feedback loop as neutrons shoot off of the nuclei of some atoms and they slam into others. And if you have enough of them together, it begins to have this positive feedback loop. So much so, we've got some very interesting examples of that in science. If you've seen the movie Oppenheimer, I haven't seen it yet myself, and I don't know if I shouldn't see it, somebody tell me, but I've been told it's a good movie. They have something there called the demon core, and it was a core of a radioactive material. And they had a shield on it, but if the shield ever got dropped on it completely, it would allow that reflection of neutrons back into it to get critical mass. And it happened for just a moment. The guy who was using a screwdriver to hold it up let it slip. And the lid dropped, and everybody saw a bright flash, and he reached and he grabbed it. And his statement after that was something to the effect of, well, that's it, boys. He was dead about a week later. The massive amount of radiation just came pouring out. Now, we should be critical mass as Christians, but not in deadly radiation, but in the salt of the earth and being the light of the world. That we show people as we come together, my goodness, that light gets brighter and brighter and brighter. That when we come together as believers, and not just at Northside, but with other believers, other churches, or out in the community, that when we come together, it's somehow, we become greater than the sum of our parts. We get to that critical mass. We have a positive feedback loop. We should be doing that as a church body, pouring into one another. God is glorified in us being spiritual salt and light as he sanctifies us and as he purifies that salt, as he brightens and cleanses that light and removes things that shade and obscure it. And God is also glorified in us being salt and light through the salvation of others, because other people get saved. Romans 9, verses 22-24. What if God, although willing to demonstrate his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction? What if God did that? That's what he's asking here. And he did so to make known the riches of his glory upon vessels of mercy, which he prepared beforehand for glory. Even us, whom he also called, not from among Jews only, but also from among Gentiles. That God looks at us as we've stepped into sin, as we've chosen that ourselves, and we've made ourselves vessels of wrath. And God says, what if instead I did a work in your life that changed you? What would that mean? Well, it glorifies God when we get saved because it shows his power. Because I cannot save myself. I cannot do it. I need somebody bigger and stronger, more powerful than any adversary I can face. And the adversaries I face are sin and death. I cannot kill and conquer them on my own, but God already has. And I'm grateful for that. God is glorified in us being salt and light when others come to salvation Be that salt and light so that others get saved. Jesus says in verse 17, a verse that has caused, I don't know how many millions of man hours, billions maybe, of deliberation. What does he mean by this? Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets, for I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. Jesus fulfilling the law did not end the law. That does not mean the same thing at all. In fact, if you take this verse to interpret that Jesus ended the law, he did away with it, we put a fancy theological term on that called antinomianism. Anti meaning against and nomi meaning law. Like Deuteronomy, nom, N-O-M, that's the second iteration of the law or the second telling of the law. Here, Jesus is saying, I did not come to do away with it. He came to fulfill it. So what exactly does that mean? Well, first to break down this idea of antinomianism, that turns into a very, very dangerous doctrine where you go, you know what, there is no law, which means there is no sin. You've been saved, go enjoy whatever you want to enjoy. That is contrary to the way God calls us to live. And in Romans chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, it addresses this. What shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin so that grace may increase? May it never be. How shall we who died to sin live in it? If Jesus was doing away with the law, Paul wouldn't write that. Those two things begin to contradict each other. No, how can we break a law if it doesn't exist anymore? The law still exists, and we do break it. Jesus didn't come to do away with it. And in Matthew 22, verses 37 through 40, Matthew 22, 37 through 40, he says, and he said to them, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets. If Jesus was doing away with the law, why did he reiterate it? He does not do away with the law. The law is still intact. But he did come to fulfill it. Maybe a better way to think of the word fulfill is satisfy. Jesus filled it up. We have lack when it comes to the law. If we had some magical punch card that every time we drove on a street, it would either mark it red or green for whether or not you abided by or broke the speed limit, what would your card look like? We have Life 360, so it always tells me, hey, Tracy completed a 10-mile drive. Her top speed was usually, almost always, under the speed limit. We're not going to talk about me. I break the law. We don't do away with the law. I just do a really poor job fulfilling it or satisfying it. Jesus does not. He's perfect. He fulfills the law perfectly. Why? How does he do this? One, he kept it perfectly. Something we can't do. To be able to stand before God on our own and say, I'm good enough to be with you in your presence forever. I must be able to say, I am perfect in obeying and upholding your law. And I have not been. I will not be. I cannot be. I am a broken creature. I am dependent upon Jesus to be the substitute for me, that he stands in my place and he upholds the law perfectly. How can one man pay for the debts of everybody? It makes sense that maybe one for one, but I've got Jesus. Who do you guys have? Well, the reason his debt can pay, or rather his payment can pay for all of our debt, is because his life is of infinite value and worth, because he is God also. He is 100% man, and he's 100% God. He kept the law perfectly. This is one way in which he satisfies it. He also satisfied every messianic prophecy of the Old Testament. He's like, hey, I fulfill the law. I live up to those prophecies. Those are about me, and I fulfill them. He has lived up to that. Nobody else has done that. He also doesn't abolish the law. He satisfies it because he provides a way of salvation that meets the criteria of righteousness. God does not circumnavigate his law in order to provide a way for us to glory, a way for us into heaven. He upholds the law perfectly. Not something I can do. And he does so in a way that satisfies the criteria for righteousness. God cannot break his own law. You may think, oh, God can do it whatever he wants. technically, there's plenty of things that he can't do because it's contrary to his nature, and he's not dishonest. He doesn't lie. He doesn't change. Those things have to remain the same. Just like you cannot say, I want a circle so round it becomes a square. It doesn't make any sense. In the same way, God cannot be something so much that it violates who he is. He cannot be so perfect and holy that he therefore sins. It breaks down. It doesn't make any sense. He provides a way of salvation that meets all the criteria for righteousness. And lastly, he preserves and guarantees the perpetual purity of his word. Verse 18, for truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law until all is accomplished. The littlest mark in Hebrew is called yod. It looks like an apostrophe. In fact, when you see something called the tetragrammaton, which is the Hebrew name of God, Yahweh, it's spelled with 4 letters. Yod, He, Vav, He. So let me do it the other way for you guys. Yod, He, Vav, He. There we go. Yod, it's just a little apostrophe. And Jesus is saying, until heaven and earth pass away, until the universe burns out, my word won't change. The smallest apostrophe will not diminish. How does God fulfill the law through Jesus? By making sure we never, ever lose it. In fact, there's been, I don't know how much scientific work done to find ancient manuscripts and compare it to what we have today. And what comes up over and over and over again is that the word we have today is the same word the apostles gave. It has not changed. If you want to talk with me about that sometime, I love apologetics. I can share with you the numbers. Jesus fulfills the law by writing it on our hearts. Jesus fulfills the law by writing it on our hearts. Jeremiah, we learned about this new covenant. Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 34. Speaking of what will come to pass one day. Behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant which I made with their fathers in the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant which they broke, although I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. But this is the covenant which I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and on their heart I will write it. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. They will not teach again, each man his neighbor and each man his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and their sin I will remember no more. Jesus fulfills the law because he writes it upon our heart. That's why we have conviction. Conviction is a wonderful, beautiful thing. We don't like it in the moment. We absolutely don't like conviction in the moment. No one likes to be told when they're doing something wrong in the middle of it. But there have been times in my life where I was living in sin and I was waiting for somebody to call me out on it. Just said, coming in for like a premarital counseling session. I was not living the way I should have been. And I was waiting for somebody to call me on my sin, and nobody did. I had the conviction. I should have acted upon it, but I didn't. How did I have that conviction? Because God wrote his law upon my heart, and I knew I was in violation. See, our effectiveness as salt and light is directly correlated to our love and dependence upon the word of God. How much do you love God's word? Without raising hands, just do it in your own mind. Do you want to know God more? I'm assuming everybody said yes. Then what's stopping you? The biggest obstacle we have to walking with God is ourselves, because we're lazy, because we're disobedient, because we let other things get in the way of walking with God. Our effectiveness as salt and light is directly dependent upon our love and dependence upon God's word. So which commandments are the lesser? It says, if anyone knows one of the least of these commandments, okay, which ones are the least? Let me know which ones I can break, the ones that aren't as important. Jesus doesn't list them. Which of God's laws are the least important? None of them. There are none that are somehow less important. Just as he won't let one yod, one little apostrophe disappear, we cannot remove any of his laws from our life. We can't do it. You can't be like, oh, it's fine, it's all right. Don't worry about that. It's okay for you to blank. We're forgiven. That's the wrong attitude. We need to have a distaste for sin because we love God's word so much. 1 John 5:3 tells us that loving God means obeying him. If we love God, we will obey him. I remember watching a friend of mine. She's a pastor's wife, and They have 5 kids. One of them, the youngest, was being disobedient. And she kind of took him by the face and she goes, "If you love me." And right then he was like, he knew what she was going to say. "You'll obey me. Go clean your room," or whatever it was. If we love God, we'll obey him. We'll want to obey him. In fact, we bring more life to other people by teaching them to obey every law. By me going like, hey, Daniel, brother, did you see that it says this in God's word? Like, hey, we can obey this. We can live this out. This is good for us. And we spur each other on to righteousness, to live the way we ought to. We become that salt and that light for other people, both lost and those who already know God, but maybe are not walking the way they ought to. Because we love this so much and we share it with others in speech and in deed. But there is a heavy, heavy reality. We cannot lead others to obey God's law if we ourselves do not know him or know his law. A friend of mine is a pastor, and I remember talking with him. He met with a woman, met with the whole family. And the matriarch of the family, he asked her, "Hey, would you like to pray?" And she's someone who said, "Yeah, I'm a believer." And she kind of paused. She gets a perplexed look on her face, and then she looks at him and she goes, "How can I say I know God if I've never spoken with him?" And she realized all the prayers she's ever said in her life were just memorized. Prayers that somebody else said, "Hey, repeat these." And she never once in her 70 plus years of life had ever spoken to God on her own. And in that moment, she broke down and she fell in love with God. And I believe she was radically transformed as she was saved. And she goes, "I don't even know God. I've been talking to a spiritual wall." How can we lead others to obey God if we ourselves do not know the lawgiver? There is one other way. If our personal righteousness, it mentions it here in verse 20, if our personal righteousness, not self-righteousness, surpasses that of the Pharisees, then we can be saved without Jesus. Let me break that down for you, okay? It's not as good as it sounds. The Pharisees considered themselves perfect, that they upheld the law perfectly. And as Jesus is talking to the people and the Pharisees are there, and Jesus goes, you want to be able to bypass all this stuff? Then you need to be more righteous than these perfect people. How are you more righteous than perfect? Here's the thing, they're not perfect. Neither are we. And as soon as somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, if you're perfect on your own, you can do this," by that point, you've already messed up. We've already sinned. Everybody sins. We do so at the youngest age. One of the very first things we do, we don't even have a memory of it. We take a toy in the nursery and we smack another kid in the head with it. Mine. We're selfish and we steal. Like that's who we are. That's our nature, and that continues into adulthood. It doesn't change until God comes and does something in our life. We cannot be perfect on our own. And since we cannot, we need Jesus. We cannot be salt and light unless we know him. We know him. We must know him. So if you don't want to go it alone, if you don't want to do this without Jesus, it requires not just thinking of yourself as perfect, you must actually be perfect. And since you can't be, and neither can I, we need Jesus. We need one who stands in that way and says, "Hey, I'm going to block your separation from God, but you need to trust in me. You need to surrender all that you are. You need to come into me, and I will give you life." And in a moment, Holy Spirit breathes life back into our soul. That when we were once dead, we become spiritually alive. We awaken, we see things for what they really are, and we become salt and light for the next generation. Church, will you bow your heads with me? We're going to have our time here at the end of the service. The band is going to come, and it's a time of application, a time for you to sit and think and do business with God and say, "Lord, I've heard this message and I've heard from your word. What do you have for me? What in my life should I be doing with this truth? How should this affect me, impact me?" I invite you to come down. Myself and others will be down front. If you want to pray with somebody, if you're saying, "Hey, I'm going through a tough time. I haven't been the salt and light I know I should be." Or maybe maybe you just need prayer. Someone by the hand and say, "Hey, will you be with me?"